Omar Rodriguez-López is most famous for being the leader and guitarist of the El Paso bands At the Drive-In and the Mars Volta. He's been a part of countless other musical efforts as well though, such as the bands Antemasque, Bosnian Rainbows, and Facto, as well as his own solo projects. Omar is probably one of the most prolific people in music and art these days, as he's currently released 52 solo albums in addition to his features and band projects. And if that wasn't enough, he's got quite a few films under his belt as well, as he's a film producer too. As you can understand, we won't even come close to understanding what he's contributed to the art world in a single video. So in this one, I'll mainly focus on three things: his early life, his most acclaimed music, and finally some of his solo music that I personally think is underrated. This is a brief introduction to Omar Rodriguez-López. Rodriguez-López was born in Puerto Rico and grew up in El Paso, Texas, US. He spent much of his childhood years in South Carolina though, and his first major step towards becoming a musician was taken when he picked up the bass guitar as a 12-year-old. He then changed to the guitar when he was 15 because he needed more strings to express himself. It was around this time that he met his future friend and longtime musical comrade, Cedric Bixler Zavala. They would practice and play together with their friend Paul Hinojos to begin with, but more friends joined the journey and would become part of their future bands too, such as Julio Venegas and Jeremy Michael Ward. Omar showed his potential as a multi-instrumentalist at a very early age. Still in his teens, he would perform with various local El Paso punk bands at the Food Plaza in Ernie's garage, sometimes on bass and guitar, other times on drums. Now, Omar was quite an adventurer too in his late teens. At 17, he spent a whole year hitchhiking around the US. Unfortunately, he got addicted to opiates sometime during the trip, but luckily he had a network of friends that helped him focus on other things when he got back to El Paso. Cedric Bixler Zavala was already in the early stages of putting together the post-hardcore band At the Drive-In. Omar joined the band initially as a backup singer and bassist. He played bass on their debut full-length album Acrobatic Tenement, and then switched to guitar after that. The band experienced a ton of success with their third full-length album, Relationship of Command, that helped them break through the mainstream rock scene. Shortly after their peak of success, they decided to break up because of a burnout from too much touring. It didn't go long before they regrouped as Facto, a band that evolved into the Mars Volta in 2001. In early 2003, they experienced the loss of their friend and bandmate Jeremy Ward to a heroin overdose. Omar had used drugs continuously with Jeremy and Cedric up until that point, but Jeremy's death convinced him and Cedric to stop what they were doing. Now, Omar was in the middle of producing his first low-budget film during this time. The movie was called A Manual Dexterity, and his bandmate Michael Ward starred in it. Omar was reluctant to releasing the movie in the end though, because of his friend's death and because of legal issues. However, he did release Volume 1 of the soundtrack that he made, and has in earlier years mentioned how he's open to release both Volume 2 of the soundtrack and the movie sometime in the future. But as of now, we really don't know that much more about these projects. A Manual Dexterity Volume 1 is not available on Spotify, and actually most of the de facto releases and his early solo albums aren't available on streaming services at all. But I know that there's been vinyl and CD pressings of these. I found quite a few retail stores on Discogs that sell this album, A Manual Dexterity Volume 1, so there are some copies out there if you want to grab a copy and you're interested. It's a very experimental record. All the tracks except the last one are instrumental, mostly consisting of ambient soundscapes, guitar noodling, and the occasional calm wisp of acoustic guitars. Some standout tracks for me personally is Around Knuckle White Tile, which really reminds me of a song from Francis the Mute. Of Blood Blue Blisters has this hybrid thing between a guitar and a human voice that came at me like a freaking jump scare. So that was really interesting. The last song on the record, Palpitations Form a Limit, is more or less a song Omar recorded with the Mars Volta members. Some people say that this was the first song that the Mars Volta performed live. But, I wasn't there and people say a lot of things, so it's really up to you whether you want to believe it or not. It's an interesting record, nonetheless. At the Drive-In and the Mars Volta were two of the most commercially successful endeavors Omar took part in. Relationship of Command is often cited as one of the best post-hardcore records of all time, although the Mars Volta experienced slightly smaller commercial breakthroughs compared to At the Drive-In. Their albums Dealhouse and the Crematorium and Francis the Mute are cited as some of the best albums from prog rock during the 2000s. But most of the 49 studio albums Omar made were made after 2005 and the release of Francis the Mute. He has created a string of solo records and found himself in his most prolific mood actually quite recently in 2016 and 17. 13 albums were made and released in 2016, and almost just as impressively, 10 albums were released the next year. That's almost one album per month. If you're a musician yourself and you hear about this creative madness, it's hard not to ask the question of quality versus quantity. Was he just putting out stuff for the sake of doing it? We'll probably never know the answer to that, but there's one thing that we know for a fact. In an interview with Toasted in 2009, Omar said this to the interviewer, quote, "For me, music is therapy. And being expressive is part of a therapy and a part of me understanding myself and my relationship to the world, my family, romance, and things like that." End quote. Maybe 2016 and 17 were years where Omar simply needed a lot of therapy. Who knows? Now, Omar's most popular solo album as of today on Spotify is Telesterion, a compilation album featuring songs from his previous albums that were released in 2011. Other fan favorites according to Spotify are Blind Worms, Pious Wine, Corazones, and Old Money. I haven't digged too deeply into his solo discography myself. I've kind of listened to some stuff here and there. But all the albums mentioned above features some of the most formulaic music that Omar's released as a solo artist. However, if you're of the more open-minded type who likes a challenging listening experience, I highly suggest you check out Sworn Virgins or Weekly Mansions. Sworn Virgins is an experimental rock and electronic music hybrid that takes you from these groovy, repeatable, hard-hitting songs to more avant-garde soaked soundscapes. Weekly Mansions, on the other hand, is Omar's take on electronic dance music. It's pretty crazy. He's dived into so many different genres in his solo discography, so there's really a lot to discover here. There's a lot of avant-garde and instrumental noodling going on in Weekly Mansions too, but my personal favorite out of these two albums that I mentioned is Sworn Virgins. Now let's back up a little bit. So after releasing Francis the Mute back in 2005, Omar decided to move to Amsterdam. He lived here from 2005 to 2007 because he loved the charm and utilities of the city. While living there, he created 6 solo albums. He also started working closely with his girlfriend at the time, Jimena Sariñana. I'm probably butchering that name. She would appear as a vocalist on many of his solo albums. It was during this time that he left the more rock and guitar-based music to try out electronic music, much like his friend John Frusciante, whom he had done multiple collaborations with over the years. I want to conclude this video by comparing Omar Rodriguez-Lopez to David Bowie. And yes, I don't want to freak people out here, I know might be a bold statement, but hear me out. Omar has played punk in At the Drive-In, jazz and prog rock with the Mars Volta, hard rock with Antemasque, and literally everything that you can imagine in his solo albums and solo career. He's a musical chameleon that jumps from one genre to another, just like how Bowie would go from folk to rock to ambient and beyond. This is why I think Omar's music is so exciting. You never know what you can expect from this guy. If you're already familiar with D-Louse and a Crematorium by the Mars Volta and Relationship of Command by At the Drive-In, then make sure you check out some of Omar's solo records. Ciencia de los Inútiles is an album I'm currently listening to now, and I think it's great, so check that out. And I also suggest you check out Sworn Virgins if you want as well. There's a lot more to be said about Omar Rodriguez-Lopez, the Mars Volta, and his various other projects. So there will be tons more videos coming out about these in the future. And in addition to that, I also make a lot of videos on my other favorite bands, such as Mastodon, Deftones, Queens of the Stone Age, and Foo Fighters. So if you're into that stuff, then make sure you stay tuned, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you later. Cheers!